Gracias, compañeros y compañeras. My name is Robin. I'm a teacher from British Columbia in Canada. I'm also a member of the British Columbia Teachers Federation Executive Committee, and I'm here with my colleague Kit Wood, who is also a member of our Executive Committee, and we're here to bring a message of solidarity with all of the teachers across North and South America. And so thank you very much for your hospitality and inviting us to be here with you and be part of these conversations. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I come from Victoria, British Columbia, which is the home of the Lekwungen-speaking people, who are now known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and I thank them for the beautiful place where I live and work. So I will talk a little bit about who the unions are and the structures of unions in Canada, and then I will pass the microphone to Kit, who will talk about the labor rights of teachers in Canada, and then he and I will share about some of the common struggles that we face across Canada as teachers, and that I think many of you will recognize as well. In Canada, all Canadian public school teachers must belong to a teachers' union. Compulsory membership is a provision in legislation in some provinces, like British Columbia. In other provinces, it's a negotiated part of the collective agreement under the labor legislation. In Canada, in English Canada, there is a single union that represents teachers, and in most of those cases, it's one for all teachers in a province. Although in other provinces, it can be different unions according to the type of school or the type of school system. For example, the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. In some provinces, school administrators are members of the teachers union, but in British Columbia and Ontario and Quebec, the school administrators are not part of our union. In Ontario, the education support staff and professionals who work in school boards and on university campuses, many of them have also chosen to join OSSPF and the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. And in Canada, in many provinces, in some of the provinces, there's two different public education systems. One secular system and another Catholic system. And the teachers in both systems belong to a union, except for in Ontario, which has a separate public school teachers union, and the Francophone teachers union for teachers who teach in the French school boards. And in British Columbia and in some other provinces, we have only non-religious secular public schools. In Canada, education is entirely the responsibility of each province or the territory, and this is set out in the Constitution of Canada. So each provincial teachers union is entirely independent from each other. And so we're separate unions, but we have one federation called the Canadian Teachers Federation, and all teachers unions belong to that federation, except for the Francophone French-speaking schools in Quebec. The Canadian Teachers Federation is not a union, it's a loose federation that coordinates communication among the unions, but doesn't have any authority over policies or collective bargaining of our members. There's almost no federal government funding or authority over any element of education or national education policies aside from federal education policies and funding for Indigenous students. The teacher unions in British Columbia and in Ontario are also affiliated with other workers, with the Canadian Labour Congress, and with our provincial federations of labour, such as the British Columbia Federation, the British Columbia Federation of Labour. So Kip will talk about the labour rights of teachers.
Thank you, Robin. It's great to be here. I'm happy to say that all Canadian teacher unions engage in collective bargaining, and most of us have the right to strike. There are a couple of teacher unions that have binding arbitration in place of the right to strike. We have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it has a freedom of association provision as one of the fundamental freedoms. The Supreme Court of Canada has recently ruled that the right to collective bargaining and the right to strike are protected by the Constitution. If you come to session 6 tomorrow, Robert and I will spend more time talking about what I'm going to talk about briefly right now, which is a recent struggle that took us more than 15 years. The limits to government action were established in a case brought by our union, the British Columbia Teachers Federation. In 2002, our government in BC passed legislation that eliminated provisions of our collective agreement that placed maximum limits on our class size, workload. It provided staffing formulas for specialist teachers, special education teachers, counselors, teacher librarians. The legislation also prohibited bargaining on these issues in the future. What happened also as a result were years and years of budget cuts. I recall in my school district, I examined 15 budget years and there were service reductions. I'll wait for the train. Can I go now? As I was saying, in my school district, there were 15 budget cycles, and in 14 of those years, they cut programs and services. We challenged this through the courts. After going through many court processes, 3 lower court decisions, the Supreme Court of Canada finally ruled in November. I think the anniversary of that decision is tomorrow, in fact. The Supreme Court of Canada finally ruled in November of 2016 that the legislation was invalid. That meant that our contract language was restored, and 3,500 additional teachers had to be hired to meet the class size limits and the specialist teacher ratios. This served as a precedent for teachers in other provinces because it was a Supreme Court of Canada decision. There was compensation for arbitrary legislation that imposed limits to collective bargaining. It's been required that governments be more cautious in considering limiting the labor rights of teacher unions and interfering in collective bargaining.
Just before I open to talk about some of the common issues facing teachers in Canada, I should have mentioned earlier when I was talking about who the teacher unions are in Canada that I neglected to say that we have another union called CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and CUPE is the largest representative of support staff workers in Canada. So educational assistants, school secretaries, custodians, groundskeepers, drivers are represented by CUPE, which is a large national union with provincial and local components. So I'm sorry to my colleagues from CUPE for forgetting that earlier. So although we don't have national education policies in Canada, we do have common challenges and common themes that Canadian teacher unions are addressing and that we're often addressing together. The first that I'll talk about is the issue of equity. Equity is always a central issue in education, and education in Canada is as a whole, it's much more equitable than it is in the US. All provinces have education finance systems that provide for distribution of resources that is generally equitable wherever a student lives, whether they live in a large urban center or they live in a more rural area. The relative equity in funding provides a reasonable equity in conditions for students no matter where they go to school. However, the unions still have to maintain pressure on the government for adequate funding in times of austerity and for adequate funding, but also for equitable funding across the school districts and across between schools. Another issue of equity is differences in student backgrounds and identity. Canada is a multicultural country. We have 2 official languages, English and French, and we have a number of Indigenous languages and also immigrant and refugee communities. So marginalization and discrimination are factors that we attempt to address within the schools and that we pressure the government to address within the funding and the structures of the school system. And we do this with varying degrees of success. In many of the Canadian unions, we have strong social justice programs, and so we work through the unions to support teachers to address inequities and discrimination in the classroom.
The second theme I'd like to talk about is Indigenous students. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this because it's also a national priority. I'm speaking slowly, deliberately, because I know that the translators have been working hard. Thank you to the translators. Canada has a history of cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples. It started with displacement from lands, moving survivors onto small reserves. It continued with generations of children taken from their homes and held in residential schools in an attempt to erase languages and culture and assimilate children. In the 1960s, it's referred to as the 60s scoop. It was an attempt to accomplish the same thing by taking Indigenous children from their homes and families, giving them to non-Indigenous families for adoption. The recent Truth and Reconciliation Commission heard stories from hundreds of survivors of these actions and the intergenerational impact. The Commission produced a report with 94 recommendations for reconciliation, many of them related to education and schools. Canadian teacher unions are addressing racism, the effects of colonialism, with curriculum development, educating teachers about the realities of the history and developing relationships with Indigenous communities.
The third issue that we have in common across Canada is the inclusion of students with special needs. And as Kip talked about earlier, this was a central piece of the collective agreement language that was stripped by the government in 2002 and recently restored. And we have an ongoing struggle in BC since that language was restored that guarantees support for students with special needs. We're finding different ways that the government is trying to cut funding and cut those resources for those students. But inclusion of students with special needs is a very high priority for teachers and their unions. In BC, we just recently had a bargaining conference to prepare for our next round of bargaining, and salary was our #1 issue for BC teachers, and the second issue for BC teachers was inclusion and staffing to support students with special needs. It's a very high priority for us in BC. There's broad support in BC for inclusion of students with special needs into classrooms and schools, but at the same time teachers feel a great deal of pressure because there's a lack of resources and a lack of supports to make this inclusion work effectively and truly support students. Most provinces have abandoned providing funding that was based on the identification of specific students who had specific designated special needs, and instead provinces are moving towards a model where they fund the school system based on the statistical prevalence of certain needs within society. And what has happened is that this leads schools and leads school districts to allocate an inadequate amount of money and inadequate resources, and they're forced to And so we're finding that we're unable to really truly meet the needs of students with special needs. This is, as I said, a high priority for teachers in British Columbia.
Number 4 on the list of issues is the mental health of teachers and students. It's a growing issue. Unions attempt to address root causes by negotiating better conditions. And we have programs to assist teachers, like our salary indemnity program and our health and wellness program. There's a troubling trend in our schools towards, or a troubling trend rather, of violence against teachers. There's also a trend of increased bullying and online violence against teachers as well as students.
The 5th issue we would like to talk about is standardized testing. And this is an issue everywhere. In Canada, most provinces do some form of their own provincial standardized testing at 2 grades in elementary schools. And teachers generally find that it is not productive in educational terms. Essentially, we learned that the results on the test reflect socioeconomic status, and the data that comes out of the tests is used as a hammer against teachers. For example, in many provinces, we have a right-wing institute called the Fraser Institute, and the Fraser Institute will issue provincial report cards that list all of the schools ranked according to their test results. The test results are never used to help improve education or to support schools or students who are struggling, but they are frequently used by real estate agents to sell higher-end houses. The BC Teachers Federation has called for parents to boycott their students' participation in these tests, and we have one court case on the right for the union to send home letters, sending letters to parents that suggest that they opt their students out of taking the test. Many provinces, in addition to the provincial testing, also take part in national and international tests, but the main impact of those tests is media coverage when the results are announced. Again, it's not improvements in education funding or support for students or teachers. Canada does quite well on the PISA results, and some provinces are identified as having high-achieving school systems by the OECD, but little notice is taken of the positive results, and there's little impact on education policy either in our jurisdictions or other jurisdictions as a result of the results, but they tend to only be used as a weapon against teachers when the results are poor.
Issue number 6 is French immersion. There's an increasing number of English-speaking parents that want their sons and daughters to go to French immersion programs. The problem is there's not enough teachers to teach in these programs. So the program is in demand, and there's a shortage of teachers.
Well, this is a big one. Number 7, an issue across Canada is discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And this has become a hot button issue recently in Canada. The provincial ministries of education and teachers unions have supported policies and programs and resources that help ensure that all students are respected and that students are not bullied because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. But bringing this into the curriculum of the schools has been met with a fierce backlash, primarily from some extreme religious groups. Recently in Ontario, we heard the sex education curriculum was an issue in the election, and when the right-wing Ford government was elected, they immediately announced that curriculum, which is a curriculum that deals with issues of consent, sexual orientation, safety, they immediately announced that curriculum would be replaced by an old curriculum which had last been used in 1998. were addressed in that curriculum. The Ontario Teachers Union spoke out very strongly in support of their members. And one of the things, I'm not sure if you mentioned, one of the things the Ford government set up was a snitch line so that members of the community could phone the government to report if teachers were using the new, better curriculum rather than the one from 1998. So the community was being encouraged to phone in to report teachers. But the union spoke out very strongly to support their members. And in just this fall, in October, we had school board elections in British Columbia, and we had a number of candidates for school boards who ran for office on one issue, and one issue only. They knew nothing about education policies or what happens in schools, but they ran on a platform of removing any resources or curriculum that supports students learning about sexual orientation or gender identity. Luckily, most of them were defeated.
The last item we'll talk about, professional development and curriculum. Many Canadian teacher unions play a role in a broad range of education policy and curriculum development, as well as extensive professional development activities and programs for teachers. While teacher unions in Canada vary in their activities and their approach to influencing education policy and practice, they also have a lot in common. We had a change in government about a year and a half ago, but it doesn't matter which government is in power. It's up to us to push back. Governments have to feel pressure from us to produce positive conditions for students, for parents, and the entire system. I'm happy to join you in that struggle. Thank you.